You are going to want to tune in for this one.
Because we're California.
Yeah, and we'd keep on doing stupid shit. You ever seen any legislation that needed to be clarified to this extent, this quickly? We have 50 states. Once again, why are we the only one dealing with this?
Employers have certain basic minimum obligations. These workers are some of the most vulnerable people in society and deserve basic protections.
He's absolutely wrong because he's assuming that everyone deserves to get treated as an employee, and that's simply not the case. Once again, they have the flexibility to generate income however they wish. You literally can go and start working for the competing company as you desire any minute of the day.
This.
You could figure out how to comply with our worker protections in exchange for getting access to a customer base of 39.5 million people.
Humane working conditions or sweeteners.
That's bullshit. Humane working conditions. They're not sticking their hands in buzzsaws, okay?
LawFlip, objection, Your Honor. Turn the game upside down. LawFlip, objection, Your Honor. Turn the game upside down.
This is an unfiltered conversation about law, life, AB5, Prop 22, and so much more. It's LawFlip. So I'm Benjy Smith. Today we have Matt Bilinsky, who is always controversial, but always entertaining, debating my partner, Louis Benowitz. So look, they both went to Cornell. They're both crazy. They're both from LA. So we're going to debate a major issue coming up in the election in November. So both of these people are lawyers. One surprisingly represents the suits. He's not the person that you would typically associate with suits, but he is. And then we have Lou, who represents employees. So let's flip the game upside down. But before we do, we have a new phone number. It's 1-833-LawFlip. That means anytime you have any legal question whatsoever, call us. So, and also please go to youtube.com/lawflip and lawflip.com to sign up to be the first to get notified for giveaways, deals, announcements, and so much more. Okay, so here's the deal. We're going to have a little bit of debate. There's a little bit of a controversy around gig economy, AB5, Prop 22. It's not the most exciting topic, but it affects all of our lives. And for some reason, the two of you are equally passionate about it, but you land on different sides of the coin. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you each a minute opening statements to say why you should or should not support Prop 22. And then we will get into the different topics, and each of you will be able to address the points, and the other person will have 30 seconds to respond. So let's start. Matt Bilinsky, give me your 1 minute on why people should or should not support Prop 22.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. Everything surrounding AB5 legislation, the new laws around classification of employees versus contractors, and the fallout from the Dynamex case in California, everything around that has been a disaster, start to finish, not just in terms of the gig economy and ride shares, every industry across the board. It essentially, you view it through the prism of pretty much California courts and legislatures looking at this particular topic and figuring how can we make things more difficult on businesses and harm workers that wish to maintain flexibility in how they participate with some of these companies. And we've got 50 states. If you look at the legislation and the parameters for this classification, the other 50 states, why is California the outlier? Why is California the one that just happens to narrow the scope for being able to classify someone as an independent contractor? That's such a deviation from pretty much any other state. Okay, and if you're doing that, you're going to look at what the historical factors in making this distinction are, and all of them overwhelmingly they slant in favor of classifying these individuals, or at least Uber drivers as they exist right now, as contractors. So why are we changing that, other than for some California legislators to be able to get some headlines looking like they're fighting for the little guy, which at this point I think even those have been negated, because I think the public sheen on this right now is understanding that it's harming a lot of these workers more than it's helping them.
Matt Bilinsky comes out swinging. Louis Benowitz, 1 minute. Let's go.
Currently in California under AB5 and the Dynamex decision, not Dynamex, it's actually Dynamex.
It's Dynamex.
Employers have certain basic minimum obligations. They have to pay their workers for all their working time. They have to reimburse them for all the expenses they incur. They have to give them paid sick time when they're sick, up to 3 days a year statewide, or 6 days for certain municipalities like Los Angeles. business. They have to provide disability and workers' compensation protection. Uber and the other gig companies, after losing in the courts, after losing in the legislature, are now trying to pass this off on you, the voter, by spending over $100 million to rig the rules solely in their favor, just for delivery drivers, not for any other classification of worker. Doing so, while it may make getting rides and deliveries a little cheaper, will leave some of our most vulnerable workers in this state even more vulnerable and force them to bear Uber and Lyft's cost of doing business. Moreover, if we ever want to change this thing, despite all the criticisms people have of AB5, what they put in this initiative is a 7/8 supermajority vote requirement to amend the thing. So just as there have been some issues with AB5 and people have sought amendments, if we ever wanted to change the rules that Uber and Lyft and these companies want to stick us with, you'd need a 7/8 supermajority. It would never happen. And that alone is reason to oppose this thing.
Okay, Louis, many argue employee status would result in app companies paying more for workers and hiring fewer workers. Why would you want that, Louis?
Because these workers are some of the most vulnerable people in society and deserve basic protections. So if you're driving for an Uber or Lyft type company, even if prices will go up, we shouldn't treat these people as disposable the second they get sick or get hurt. And if we don't extend basic employment protections to them, that's exactly what's going to happen.
Matt, is Louis wrong?
He's absolutely wrong because he's assuming that everyone deserves to get treated as an employee, and that's simply not the case. These people are already. What you're saying is that what's occurring right now, this is what has been occurring through the entirety of Uber's operating history and Lyft's operating history is not feasible, but it clearly is feasible because these people continue to drive for Uber. They continue to voluntarily enter into a relationship, a service-based relationship with these companies, and accept payment in exchange for their efforts and services. So if you're saying that this is an untenable situation, well, it clearly is tenable because people are operating under it right now. And just because some people happen to be, and we can have the academic discussion over what constitutes vulnerability and what isn't, but just because you're vulnerable doesn't mean you outright deserve to get classified as an employee. That would pretty much wipe out the concept of an independent contractor nationwide, statewide, across the universe. Because, okay, as long as someone may or may not be in precarious financial circumstances, they then do deserve to avail themselves of being an employee and all the benefits and privileges that come along with that.
30 seconds. Okay, go, Louis.
So the ABC test addresses this, and so your core criticism is you hate the ABC test. But the ABC test makes determining who's an employee versus who isn't really easy, and the second prong of it, whether you're doing the same work as the business you're working for, really answers this question for who gets to be an employee. And there are exceptions to AB5 for people with negotiating leverage, and these exceptions are evolving unless we decide to go pass a law that takes away the legislature's ability to ever address evolving situations.
You can answer this in your next follow-up. Use your next minute. Okay. App drivers are usually of modest means, Matt. Don't they deserve the basic protections as other workers, Matt? Or you want to take those protections away?
No, because these are not default basic protections of all workers. There are some protections that are appropriate for those who are appropriately classified as employees, and protections that are in place to be appropriately classified as independent contractors. As Louis acknowledges, there's an avalanche of exceptions to AB5. When there are an avalanche of exceptions to a law, doesn't that seem to insinuate that the law is not well thought out? Yes, we all know that's the answer. There's tons. There's exception after exception after exception because the law is stupid in the first place. Yes, the idea that you can only be a contractor if the service that you provide has nothing to do with the core business of the business, that's ridiculous. That's not reflected in the laws and the legislation in any other state in the country ever in the history of America. It's ridiculous.
Louis, is California nuts like they say?
No, California simply doesn't want companies like Uber and Lyft to be able to pass their costs of doing business onto their workers. So if I'm a delivery driver for a restaurant and the restaurant employs me directly, then that restaurant has to fully reimburse me for my car expenses. What Uber's seeking to do is reimburse at about half of the IRS rate.
Yes, but there's this interesting thing where if you're an employee for that restaurant, you don't get to just decide, hey, I'm going to flip a switch and all of a sudden I'm not working for your restaurant, I'm working for this other restaurant with 100% of my own discretion on the turn of a fucking dime. That's a different set of circumstances because can't just say, oh, this is the service that they're providing, thus they should be treated the same. No, one has different parameters and terms and conditions around what they're allowed to do and the nature of their services versus the other one. If the situation was that these restaurateurs, that there was a system in place for these delivery drivers for restaurants to literally like, hey, from 8:15 to 8:30, I'm gonna do one delivery for this restaurant, then I'm going to do a delivery for this other restaurant, and then I'm going to do this delivery for this other restaurant, and they actually happen to be competing restaurants. That person should not be treated the same as someone who says, I am a full-time employee or even a part-time employee that is only allowed to work for this company and do deliveries for this restaurant.
Okay, so Matt, Louis, to that point, he came right in time. Louis, won't employee status reduce employee schedule flexibility and other flexibility?
No, because you could still have someone classified as an employee, and while they are engaged in the active duties of employment, they could be subject to those entitlements. So when a worker isn't working and not suffered or permitted to work, then that worker doesn't need to be paid. If they're just in uncontrolled time not working, you'd still have this flexibility. It's simply that Uber wants to dodge expense reimbursement and payroll taxes, and to some extent paying people for unproductive time that's inherent to its service because it's able to shift its costs under its proposed model.
Matt, why isn't the flexibility argument bullshit?
Because what he said is outright incorrect. That they're not going to have to schedule drive times. They are. Like, this is not even a question. Like, no, you're going to have to drive during prescribed times. You're not. The current situation is you want to drive 8:15 to 8:17, you fucking do it, and then you flip the fucking switch. Okay, that's not going to be available. Nor does it make sense if you're going to classify them as employees. So that is a fundamental distinction, and it's simply like the argument that that either one. From a practical perspective, or even two, from a legal perspective, and ensuring that the terms and conditions, the new service terms and the new employment terms match the legislation, inherently is at odds with the notion of them maintaining any scheduling flexibility. Like, it's impossible. This is not an opinion. Like, literally, we're saying like, hey, we're going to have these drivers work in shifts and get paid for time that they may or may not be driving anyone.
This.
That's part of the job. B, if Uber wanted to address this, you could address it legislatively with an hours work carve out while keeping employee status. So different industries in California have different hours work definitions. For example, on-site apartment managers who live on the property, their definition of hours worked is their time spent carrying out assigned duties. Healthcare workers are just subject to the federal suffered or permitted to work standard. So you could still maintain employee status with the panoply of protections with a much narrower legislative fix than denying employee status. So you could, let's say, take a modified hours work definition, get to where Uber wanted to be, and still not gut all of the employment protections.
Louis, you continue to say why someone should be able to do one thing or the other based on the legislation, but you have not explained why the legislation makes sense.
The legislation makes sense from an
other than hey, these workers might be in precarious financial circumstances, thus we should pay them more. That is the only basis.
Isn't that a pretty good argument?
No, it's not a good argument at all.
Okay.
They're adults who are entering into a voluntary transaction with another company, and to the extent that they are allowed to chart their own course, to work for other companies and find any other way to make money that they want. No, the company does not owe them the minimum wage and other protections that they would owe a full-time employee.
Louis, where does Matt have it wrong there?
California, for more than a century, through the Industrial Welfare Commission wage orders, through Labor Code 1194, through a whole long list of court decisions, has maintained a strong public policy of protecting workers. Whether that policy is something that you'd want to do away with, that's a separate...
Interesting. So here's the question. Why wasn't it good enough? Why do they need to layer more on top of it since we're already operating under that regime that you believe is very sensible?
Because AB5 is just simply, and the ABC test is simply easy to administer. So when we're looking at employment cases, a lot of the time we're looking at class and representative actions for how you hold corporate employers accountable. And so the ABC test, especially elements B and C of it, are objective criteria that are easy to apply class-wide and be able to say yes or no, is this group of workers are these workers employees or independent contractors? And so having a law that works from a labor law enforcement perspective within California's overall statutory scheme is consistent with California's public policies that the legislature has already decided are the policies it wants to pursue.
Okay, Matt. Gig drivers put a lot of wear and tear on their cars driving for work. Prop 22 proposes paying 50% less than IRS mileage reimbursement rates. Why is it fair for app companies to pass these costs on to their workers?
Because because they have they have the flexibility to generate income however they wish. These companies are not saying you're not allowed to make money any other way. You literally can go and start working for the competing company as you desire any minute of the day. So once again, not every piece of Prop 22 is perfect. So I could maybe say, bump that up to 75 or even match it at 100%. But that's still a subtopic. That's still a sub feature of Prop 22. Okay, the main feature is maintaining the classification as independent contractor.
Yeah, but that's the maintenance of the independent contractor classification has the primary effect of depriving employees of all of these benefits.
Once again, that's
they're not just, these app companies aren't just like in the abstract saying let's make these independent contractors because we just like the term independent contractor.
But listen, these companies, given that these people are properly classified as independent contractors, they don't owe these people that. But if we are trying to throw a couple sweeteners in the deal to say, okay, if we're trying to sweeten this and saying, listen,
humane working conditions or
humane working, that's bullshit. Humane working conditions. They're not sticking their hands in buzzsaws. Okay, what if you want to craft specific legislation, specific sub legislation because of the nature of this company around reimbursement for gas or for wear and tear on the car? I mean, that's fine. But it's something that's sensible that customizes the solution for the nature of the job, because this is and also because these are companies that do have such a significant impact on the lives of the citizens in the state. That's fine. Okay, but there's a fundamental distinction between whether or not they're employees or whether they're contractors, and there's no reason that the basic foundation of Prop 22 is sound, that these people should remain contractors. And as Louis even said, if we have these policies in place that seem to be that for a century now have slanted in favor of protecting workers' rights, well, that's the regime we're operating under right now. Why is it not good enough?
Yeah, Louis, a lot of the drivers for these gig companies say they want to be independent contractors. They want it, right? A lot of people, they want it. Why shouldn't we just give them what they want?
Because they don't fully understand the consequences of the decision. So they hear the word independent and assume independent equals flexibility and that there's no other path to get to the same point, while devaluing the things they'd be giving up. So,
are you saying that some people want things against their own self-interest?
People definitely want things against their own self-interest.
That adults should not be able to voluntarily enter into transactions.
No, adults should be able to voluntarily enter into transactions, but minimum labor standards are basically a statutory form of unconscionability from contract law.
So pretty much what you're saying is that any classification of someone as an independent contractor is per se unconscionable.
No, it's not per se unconscionable.
That's kind of what you just said.
No, there's certainly a presumption in favor of employee status. The burden of proof on proving someone's an independent contractor falls on the employer under current law, but and the employer can rebut that.
Let's get it out of the way. You obviously, Matt, favor there are some times where you favor that somebody should be classified as an employee, and Lou, there are some times where you think that they should be considered an independent contractor. Where are the times?
Yeah, please. If these people, if it's so anathema that anyone who simply may not be getting all the benefits of employment to not be an employee, then when do you think it's appropriate for anyone to be an independent contractor?
I'll flip it on you before you get to that. Where is it proper for them to be an employee in anything like this?
My non-exhaustive answer is if you work full time for someone and you, under the terms of your employment, are not allowed to work for anybody else, nor anybody, or even not any necessarily any competitor, and if your employer says you have to be there from 9 to 5, and if you're not there from 9 to 5, you don't get to work for me, that's a fucking employee.
Okay, and Lou, where is he wrong on that?
I view employment status versus independent contractor status as someone running their own business or who has an independent consulting business, something where they have negotiating leverage, they're providing an independent service to another business. That's where independent contractor status makes sense. So if a driver decided to contract on his or her own while running some sort of delivery business with a restaurant, that person, I would think, could be a properly classified independent contractor. It's where you have the third party who's in the business of providing a driving or delivery service, who's just basically employing a bunch of people to do that very job, that you've just created people who aren't entrepreneurs. They're not really running any sort of business. They're just doing the job of that company.
So what you've done is merge the notion of vendor and the notion of contractor. That the only people who can be independent contractors are independent business vendors. And I think that's never in the history of American business or law has any state or any municipality merged those two concepts and say, like, listen, unless you're an independent entrepreneur running an independent business, you cannot be an independent contractor.
About half the states follow the ABC test as their law, actually. So it's not just California that's done this. Massachusetts, lots of other states apply the ABC method, and it's a work in progress
along with other
legislative
tests.
Exception. So
along with many of the other prompts.
Let me jump into it, Matt. Don't the apps just generally have shitty business models? Isn't that the real issue here? They basically artificially low prices backed by venture capital funds and operating at a loss. Isn't this kind of a just distraction?
So? No, it's not a distraction. They're two completely mutually exclusive topics.
You don't think that the reason for these businesses not operating at a profit has nothing to do with the employment
if
issue?
they had to operate at a profit, one, they would provide a much rarer, much less efficient, and much less widespread service. Okay, you want to be waiting 27 minutes for every Uber and you want to pay 3 times the cost? Okay, let's stop. Sorry, there's no consequence to this stuff. There's not this, there's all these poor drivers and so we need to make sure that they're paid more. Well, I'm sorry, there's consequence to that. Okay, there's no business impact. Like, you're not going to be able to provide rideshare services in any semblance of how they've been provided over the past 6 or 7 years if you want to require, no matter that, once again, require that all drivers be treated in this manner. It's just impossible.
Louis.
If you want to say, just one last thing. If you want to say, these companies, your Uber is subsidized by Saudi Arabian oil money. Okay, there's money.
They are.
Oil. No, I'm not. Oil comes out of the ground in Saudi Arabia. That generates money. The Saudi Arabian royal family has sovereign wealth funds that invest in SoftBank and other venture capital funds that have been funding Uber's losses. Funded Uber's losses for a long time, and they're now major stakeholders in Uber as a public company. That's a reality. But how Uber is maintaining an inefficient business model while what they really try to do is establish themselves as the primary driverless car company for the next 30 years. It's really what they're trying to do. Fine. Is that the most... do I love that? No, but it's a reality. But that still doesn't have any impact on the nonsensical
You're viewing the independent contractor employee debate as in a vacuum, irrespective of what the business model is.
Yes, of course. Other than just saying, oh well, this is a company that does bad things, and this because they're not a very socially responsible company that operates with a profitable business model. Then we have to have a nonsensical classification of their workers. How do those two things connect?
Okay, so I think there's a point of agreement here, which is we both agree that they're ultimately heading over to self-driving cars and that the workers are an interim piece of this whole equation. So what then we're really talking about is how much they could squeeze these workers over that interim time period to try to make themselves either smaller money losers or less unprofitable or more profitable, depending on their accounting, who really knows what's going on there. But the idea of somewhat reduced service at higher prices, we don't know what the supply-demand curve will wind up looking like for the full impact on service. But the idea of paying more for this service to work because there's a demand for it, I think people would still pay more for this service. You'll just have fewer customers, and that might not be the worst thing in the short term until they get to their driverless model.
That's always the excuse. Oh, well, the business is going to suffer, but who really cares? No. This is something that needs to be taken into consideration. Like, yeah, this is going to have...
So if the business suffers, because if the business suffers in and of itself, funded by Saudi money, it's operating at a loss.
It's because if you look at the historical and customary principles by which this classification is made, I'm sorry, anyone who's looking at this, anyone who's objectively looking at this knows that most of the factors slant in favor of these people being classified as contractors. Only this new outlier California legislation. I'm sorry, there's a reason that we're the only state this is happening in. And yeah, New York and Massachusetts are considering some similar changes, but they haven't. We're the only one dealing with the job losses and and all the disruption from AB5. Why are we the only ones dealing with this?
Okay, Louis, you could add to Matt's point here, but isn't this going to harm consumers because more expensive drivers, more expensive rides?
There may be some price increases, but some of this will be mitigated by things like pooled rides. So if we ever escape this stupid pandemic,
so the only thing is that the only counterpoint to the prices will increase are, you can just go do Uber Pool.
I mean, they offer the pool service, and so, yes, there's going to be some sort of price increase because I assume they're not going to make themselves less profitable if they're already claiming to lose money. So, yes, prices will go up. I'll concede that point because there's not much argument to it.
Okay, so, Matt, classifying drivers as employees would provide them with paid sick time. We're already in the midst of a pandemic, and creating incentives for sick people, many of whom lack health insurance, to continue working while sick is against the public interest. Why is that not true? By
your insinuation that it is in the public interest, thus must be implemented, once again, negates the concept of an independent contractor, period. You're saying just because people may be in tough circumstances means that whoever they're doing work for has to treat them as an employee. Under your logic, where is there any room for anyone to be an independent contractor? Because all you have to do is say, well, we're in tough times right now. This person might not be making enough money. Thus, you have to classify them as an employee.
Louis?
Someone who actually has their own business would not be an employee.
Not everyone can have their own business.
And not everyone can be an independent contractor.
Yes, but some people need to be able to. And by the logic that you guys are putting forward right now, nobody could be one.
It's not true. There are myriad exceptions to AB5 and...
that had to be specifically legislated because there was so much displacement and destruction from the general law.
And it's an ongoing process. So the idea that...
legislation, a binary bifurcated classification should not be an ongoing process of, oh shit, fuck, we didn't realize that we're going to put all these independent writers and bloggers out of any source of income, and now we have to make exceptions. Or all these session musicians we're gonna put them on the streets because they can't do their work anymore.
They always got to clarify legislation after they.
You ever seen any legislation that needed to be clarified to this extent, this quickly?
Well, this is also the greatest revolutionary. The gig economy is unbelievably changing the entire world.
It's been around for about 8 years now, and we have 50 states. Once again, why are we the only one dealing with this?
Because we're California, and we've decided that we prioritize worker protection. So businesses, because California has a population of 39.5 million, there is a certain extent of you could figure out how to comply with our worker protections in exchange for getting access to a customer base of 39.5 million people.
That's it. There's more impact from the law. Thus, you should have to comply with it more. I don't know about that argument.
The alternative you're proposing is letting these companies pay to have whatever rules they want for themselves.
It's so incorrect. Pay to allowing companies to continue operating under the rules that they've been operating on for the past 7 years since their inception. And number two, operating based on rules that do align with principles that have been governing this decision for decades. And govern it once again in every other state.
Yes, except under previous law, even applying the Borello test, the first two factors under the Borello test are prongs A and B of the ABC test. So whether the worker is free from control and whether the worker is doing distinct work from the business itself are the very first two factors under the Borello test.
Well, that doesn't really matter because B and C in the dynamics of the ABC test essentially negate one. Because if you don't have B and C, you don't have A doesn't matter.
Explain.
Since you have to both allow the worker to have full control over the manner in which they work, and they have to not be operating in the same core business as the main company, who cares? If you give the worker, this person, full control, if you say to an Uber driver, as long as you don't violate the law, operate this car and this service however the hell you want. Just because the core business of Uber is rideshare, as long as they're providing rideshare, the control factor doesn't matter. So you've just wiped out one of those two prongs that you say are consistent.
No, so those are consistent with the Borello factors, which are Borello is a multi-factor balancing test.
If there's 10 factors and you knock out 7 of them and then kind of knock out another one, there's no consistency there.
No, you end up with a far more consistent application of the law with the ABC test because you could say if any of these elements aren't met, the worker is an employee, and for purposes of labor law enforcement on a class or representative basis, which makes enforcement a lot easier, which is a high state priority, then you could apply this thing.
So we'll make it, because it's easier to enforce, we will make a decision that has no a very loose logical basis and harms businesses, and that a lot of workers don't even want us to implement, but because it's easier, that's a justification. I'm not sure I see that as a justification.
In California, we've historically construed laws governing conditions of employment in favor of protecting employees. So unless you feel like undoing over a century of California Supreme Court precedent, then that's a policy decision.
Matt, closing argument.
Closing argument. I was I think I've
you have 60 seconds. Go
I've
for
made
it.
most of them, but you just said 100 years of precedent. I want to maintain the 100 years of precedent. You're the one that wants to change the 100 years of precedent. I want Uber to continue to be able to operate as it has been operating under the same worker laws that it has been operating under. This is AB5, the ABC test and how it's being applied are a complete deviation from the entire legislative and commercial history of California, and once again of every other state. Okay, look. It's no coincidence California's the only ones dealing with this. And if the answer is, well, California, we just like to protect workers. Well, one, you're going to harm a lot of workers. You're going to take away the source of income that a lot of people are using to supplement an otherwise difficult circumstances. You're going to take that away, and we can talk about all these airy principles of like, well, Uber should be able to pay more. They can't. And they're not going to, and it's going to put a lot of people out of work. It's also going to disrupt the lives of a lot of people. And we talk about a lot of people were able to handle some of their tough financial circumstances by not having to go get themselves into a car payment because they had rideshare available to them. They will no longer have that. There are second, third, and fourth, and fifth wave order impacts of this decision that we're seeing play out. There's a reason the judge granted the injunction, because they saw what the impact. They were calling Uber's bluff, and it turned out not to be a bluff. And they say, oh shit, this is actually going to happen. We can't allow them to shut down in California. I just don't think this is theoretical. We're seeing how it's playing out.
Louis.
So just going to the injunction issue, it's more that Uber can pay damages ultimately. Uber's been accruing class-wide damages for years, and so if you impose a restitution order under the unfair competition law, the fact that you tacked on a few months between now and October won't really matter. But regardless, what ultimately we're dealing with the free market economy, and there will be other competitors who emerge who decide, you know what, we could comply with this. We don't need to give in to Uber and Lyft and DoorDash. There are ultimately going to be companies that find a way to make this work. You're talking about a customer base of potentially 39.5 million people.
Interesting that they haven't so far.
We will see. What we learned today. So it was a spirited debate. We all had a good time. You all learned a lot. We got a little bit inside baseball, but I think you guys get the point. There are two smart people, beautiful looking guys on this couch. Really interesting guy.
Check all those boxes all around.
And this is a great debate. It's going to be happening for the next few months. We're looking forward to the election. Are you a MAGA supporter? I'm just kidding. We're not going there. Anyways, call us, email us, text us, comment on all of the posts, and ask more questions of Louis and Matt. We'll have them guest comment in our Instagram. We'll have them answer questions on YouTube. Let's keep the debate going. See you next week. LawFlip.
LawFlip, objection, Your Honor. Turn the game upside down. LawFlip, objection, Your Honor. Turn the game upside down.
Okay, so Ariane, they're asking where they could find us. So for LawFlip, it's at LawFlip and LawFlip.com. For Smith & Benowitz, our law firm, which does personal injury, employment, and class actions, you can find us at Smith Benowitz and SmithBenowitz.com. For the personal stuff, like where you're really going to find the juicy stuff, at Benjy Smith and BenjySmith.com. At Wages Guru and LouisBenowitz.com for Louis. Oh, so LawFlip is produced, directed, and edited by the young legend Ariane Tabibi, visual effects and compositions by another young legend, Oren Azad. Intro music provided by Pen Practice. Pen Practice, what is it? Premium instrumentals for upcoming artists by the music industry's top producers. For more info, visit penpracticemusic.com. I had so much fun recording the intro song with my man Hilton Deuce Wright. Looking forward to hearing more and more from Pen Practice. So the LawFlip identity, this hot logo that you're looking at, created by Garrett Whiston and Travis Nagel. Special thank you to Shai and Seth from the Horwitz Marketing Agency. A huge thank you to Aaron and Vanessa from Smith & Benowitz for endlessly dealing with all of our podcast bullshit. And lastly, a huge thank you to our beautiful wives, Julie and Lisa, for supporting our vision, and all the love to all of our 4 boys combined. Disclaimer, this podcast is made available by Smith & Benowitz for educational and entertainment purposes only. It is only intended to provide general information and opinions about legal and other concepts, and is not intended to be used as a source of legal advice or relied on for legal advice. By listening to this podcast, you understand that no attorney-client relationship is being formed between you and Smith & Benowitz or any of its attorneys. This podcast should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice from a licensed professional attorney in your state.